Well, Chairman Clark and members of the Board of Trustees, President Hunt and faculty colleagues, all those who labor and study here at Chicago Theological Seminary on behalf of our mission, greater justice and mercy, all friends of that mission, and those, if there be enemies, to you welcome also, and peace be with you. I want to learn how to listen better to those who grieve. I'm trying to learn how to listen better. Not in order to explain their grief, but to attend more, to understand more, and to respond more fully and more fittingly and more faithfully. However it is we finally respond to the loss that another has suffered, I am persuaded it must be born of a deep and a deeper listening. Grief, however, can present itself in so many different ways and can touch on everything in the world and beyond, seen and unseen, and everything that is or was or is to come. Grief can express itself through thoughts and feelings that seem like utter contradictions. Love that sounds like fear. Pain that sounds like joy. Doubt that sounds like faith, and faith that sounds like doubt. No that sounds like yes, and yes that sounds like no. And arguments that sound like prayers, and prayers that sound like earthquakes. And stories, and dreams, and dramas, and songs, and prayers. In the face of this, a listener can simply be overwhelmed in the same way that both a breaking wave and a flood can overwhelm us. And this is no less true of listening to one's own grief. Your grief is speaking and telling you something about you and the world in which you live. How can you listen? And it is with the particular that I'm concerned right now. With the particular. The particular person who speaks, the particular person who listens, the particular loss, and the particular ways it comes to expression. There is time to join grief to grief. There is time to recognize and name how our losses echo in the losses of others. And perhaps to find comfort or even consolation in this infinite community of grief. The first task, however, is to honor the particular by seeking to hear and understand. I can't know what you know unless you tell me. Those lines from Adrienne Rich, who died herself not long ago. They reflect a truth. The other person is a mystery. Who that person is, what she knows, what he has seen, how the other person has formed a mind map or a heart map of the world. If we want to know, they will have to tell us. And perhaps they will even need to tell us in order to know it themselves. How do I know what I think till I hear what I say, says the old adage. Maybe we could rewrite Rich's line. I can't know what I know unless I tell you. Even if that telling is silent. There are gashes in our understandings of that world, she wrote. Another important truth. There are gashes in our understandings of this world. You know, Augustine suggested, in fact, that any understanding of the other person requires a kind of divine intervention. Any understanding of the other person. The reality of one person speaking and another person listening and understanding is impossibly fraught with obstacles, he thought. And if communication really were to happen, it would require a kind of divine intervention, an inner teacher who finally understands both the speaker and the hearer and can bring this fraught sharing to pass. Gashes in our understandings of this world, she wrote. Gashes. It's a wound word. Not empty spaces, blank places on a map, omissions, any of which might be benign enough, unimportant enough, but gashes which are never benign or unimportant. Cuts that are deep and long, through the surface, down into muscle, perhaps even deeper. Our understandings of this world, mine, yours, mine and yours. The understandings that we, and who is this we? The understandings that we share, recognized and unrecognized, are wounded. How would they come to be that way? Pick the explanation you prefer. Philosophical, religious, theological, psychological, physiological, cultural. The categories could be longer. And any and all of them offer answers to the question. But perhaps more immediately, I'm simply a finite human being with a finite ability to understand and an unlimited ability to fill the world from my own wounds, my own fears. And however it has come to pass, what matters is how we will, nevertheless, in the moment of one person speaking and another person listening, despite all the reasons that get in our way, try to understand. And if these challenges beset us in even ordinary talk, how much more do they beset us in speaking and listening and understanding one another in our grief? Frederick Buechner wrote, "In any one town, anywhere, there is grief enough to freeze the blood. In any one town, anywhere, there is grief enough to freeze the blood. Walk down an ordinary street and every house is haunted. Why speak about grief and loss? Well, perhaps simply to have something instead of nothing to say. Between grief and nothing, I will take grief," wrote William Faulkner. "Between grief and nothing, I will take grief. The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say," says the bereaved King Lear. The weight, the gravity, the grief requires some kind of reply. A word, a sigh, a gesture of the head, a lowering of the eyes, more extravagantly perhaps a sob or a howl, both inarticulate and eloquent. Death has come, and we must respond, if for no other reason than to demonstrate that one is still alive and speaking. In time, the speaking will become more complex. It will take on a shape and a vocabulary, perhaps in accordance with a particular tradition, perhaps in defiance of one, perhaps one that is original and particular, or perhaps one that repeats the lyrics of a popular song that you can hear on any radio with the turn of the dial. And the speaking may take up a kind of argument about death or life or both, perhaps about the ways of the world or duty or justice or love. It may tell stories, great and small, or bring forth poetry or myths or ancient hymns and testimony and wisdom. And the speaking will go on speaking to perform rites and rituals and ceremonies and memorials and liturgies and celebrations and dramas with processions and rites and chanting, mementos, offerings, shrines, wakes, eating, drinking, visitations, assemblies, reunions. The bodies of the dead, if we have them, will be washed, anointed, embalmed, wrapped, viewed, burned, buried in the earth, a cave, a tomb, a mausoleum, a family plot, at sea, in a churchyard, in a military cemetery, a place consecrated or not, marked or not, decorated or not, visited and tended or not, as time goes by. And as the time goes by, speaking continues. For periods of mourning, anniversaries, yahrzeits, holy days, in journals, letters, memoirs, in more stories, poems, songs, web postings, YouTube, in conversations, late night ramblings, parties, counseling, toasts, elegies, prayers. And some of it will be sad, and some of it fearful, and some happy, some angry or worried or hilarious, longing, relieved, grateful, resentful, forgiving. And it will be no less complex and fraught than the web of relationships and experiences and histories and fears and hopes in which it all takes place. Why all this speaking of grief? The most important reason may be that if we don't find ways to bring loss and grief to expression, much of our life and its meaning, perhaps the parts that most need expression and meaning, will be silenced and hidden, even from us. Loss and grief make a special demand for meaning and a special demand upon meaning. It is because of loss and grief that the need for meaning arises most urgently. For loss and grief are what test most severely the meanings of our lives. And in the face of loss and grief, that meaning or its absence matters most. So by putting grief into expression, we come to know ourselves, to remember, to testify, to reach out to others, to respond, to frame the stories of our lives, the world, even the cosmos. Even the cosmos. To test our ideas against one another, to do what we believe is right, what we believe is true, to live the way we believe we ought to live. But why should we listen to grief? Well, some don't, or won't, or at least not for long. They will speak instead of listening, or they too need something to say in the case of death. After the death of his wife, C.S. Lewis wrote in his grief journal, "Perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated in special settlements like lepers." Perhaps the bereaved ought to be isolated in special settlements like lepers. He felt like he was an embarrassment to everyone he met. They didn't know what to say, so they said silly things or avoided him altogether. He felt he was representing a future for them that they all feared. A death's head, he called himself. A death's head. Grief speak is what another widower called the kind of things that others sometimes said to him. They would offer sweet, well-meaning words that persuaded him they did not understand at all. I know exactly how you feel. I feel your pain. It's a strange thing, he wrote in a letter to his dead wife, how that innocent, well-meant remark can sometimes make me want to rise up and say, no, no, you don't. No, you don't at all. And nowhere may this be more true than in what is offered as comfort or consolation, which can be even harder to talk about than grief. Truth be told, a comforter may be responding more to his or her own discomfiture, including, of course, the genuine desire to offer help and consolation. The comforter may be seeking comfort too by speaking instead of listening. But what sounds right in the ears of the comforter can sound worse than wrong in the ears of the bereaved. In the face of the suffering and death this world has known and has always known, the very idea of consolation can appear as denial, as whistling past the graveyard, as wishful thinking, fantasy, cover-up, mystification, or worse, consent to injustice, even moral collusion with evil and death, something that cannot, should not, indeed, must not be. And apart from the general vulnerability of life to death, there have always been the particular losses that have always exceeded the bounds of any possible consolation. And we can hear echoed again and again this sense of being bereaved of the dead, but also being bereaved of the living, bereaved of understanding, set apart, alien. Why listen to grief? Because we don't know. Because there are gashes in our understandings of this world. Because if we don't listen, something of great importance may never be heard into speech, to recall the late Nell Morton, herself dead these 25 years. Because even Christ went down to the hell of grief and grief of hell. Because the person speaking grief is the human face and the human voice of the grieving God. Because if we do not grieve with those who grieve, we cannot rejoice with those who rejoice. Because if we do not listen, we will not know how to attend, to mourn, to console, to comfort. And even if such a thing is possible at all, or simply to keep faith with those who grieve. Why listen to grief? For the sake of our own griefs as well. For the sake of our own griefs as well. Perhaps this human voice of the grieving God is saying a word to us. And we listen for the sake of the griefs that we must bear, the griefs we must bear. The grief at hand is not the only one we face. Not the only death and loss that has or will grieve us. That is, rob us. Including our own. Remember that thou art dust, and to dust you shall return, says the Ash Wednesday liturgy. Ashes to ashes, says to dust, dust to dust, says the minister at the graveside. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down, says the nursery rhyme. So speaking grief and listening change places. And the listeners become speakers, and the speakers become listeners, and on in the community of grief. And at any given moment, the same person can be both, attending to one's own grief and another's, attending to one's own grief through another's, attending grief itself. We grieve as a kind of work, as a kind of healing, as a kind of binding of a wound, as a kind of stewardship of love, of energy, of strength, of relationship, in search for balance and equilibrium, as a kind of resistance, as a protest, as a refusal to cooperate or agree in any way with the power of death, as a discipline of memory, by thinking hard and long, by examination and re-examination, as a navigation of uncharted territory, redrawing the maps as we go, accompanied and alone, helped and hindered, climbing and falling, slipping back and going forward once again, questioning meaning, making meaning, receiving meaning, meeting meaning, silent, talking, writing, weeping, singing, praying. What can become of grief's experience and we who grieve? What comfort or even consolation can there be? This question, this most difficult question, is a kind of scandalon. Scandalon, a Greek word that means a scandal or a stumbling block. The Hebrew Bible presents testimonies of both wisdom and faith and challenges both in terms that are as searing as can be. In the Bible, grievers rage and lament and weep and rend their hearts and garments and call to account everything and everyone, from the ways of the world to the poor comforters who would explain and justify it, to the God who made it. Christian scriptures speak of the death of Jesus as a stumbling block, as an offense to both wisdom and religion that calls both into question and lays both bare, and in a great paradox proclaims it as ultimate consolation for that very reason. And yet, the psalmist will testify, "You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have taken off my sackcloth and clothed me with joy." And the prophet speaks of a holy mountain where death is swallowed up forever and all the nations feast together. And the apostle who insists that the gospel preaches Christ crucified still hymns the new creation of heaven and earth and the unthinkable transformation of resurrection. And John the Revelator prophesies in ecstasy of a holy city where death and tears are no more. If we are to speak of these things aright, if in the face of loss and grief we are to offer a word of consolation that is consolation indeed and not denial, wishful thinking, fantasy, mystification, cooperation with evil and death, something that cannot, should not, and must not be. If we are to speak of a scandalous consolation, a consolation beyond consolation, aright, it will be the grieving who teach us. And we will learn through listening how to grieve and speak with those who grieve and speak. Can there be love again? Sanity? Peace? Joy? Continued relationship with the living and the dead? Can there be a day that is not lived in pain? Can grief be something more than pain and still be grief? Can grief indeed also be love and joy and sanity and peace and a source of wisdom and compassion and holy power and justice power? Can there be comfort? Can there be consolation? If the testimony of those who grieve counts as evidence, if their testimony counts as evidence, the answer to such questions can indeed be yes. Yes. But it may be a difficult yes. It is a yes that may sound and feel again and again like no. A yes that may not be believed or believable if it does not confess why such a possibility can seem like a fantasy or a wish dream or a lie. Or a scandalous stumbling block. It is a yes that even for those who trust no religion must be an article of faith in what cannot be seen in advance. It's the kind of yes that requires those who say it to commit themselves to those to whom they have listened and to whom they speak and with whom they seek to keep faith. And now we have left the realm of theories and arguments, and models, psychologies, and entered that of stories and songs, and mystery, and ultimate things. So I leave the last word to a canticle drawn from the 35th chapter of Isaiah, appointed for the third Sunday in Advent. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as a rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with praise and singing. For the ears of the deaf shall hear, and the eyes of the blind shall be opened. For the tongue of the dumb shall sing, and the lame will dance for joy. For the ground will become a pool, and the dry land become springs of water, as the ransomed return to the Lord. They shall come back unto Zion, singing unto Zion, with joy, with joy. Come singing with joy, with joy. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It will blossom abundantly and rejoice with praise and singing. The singing. The singing.